Welcome to our channel. Today we embark on an investigation that pierces the veil of a long-standing historical narrative. For decades, a specific thesis has been cultivated in textbooks and political forums across the globe. The claim that the Holocaust was an exclusively European phenomenon, a tragedy born and bred on Western soil for which the Middle East bears no connection or responsibility. We are told that the suffering of the Jewish people in the mid-20th century was a foreign cataclysm, an imported justification for the existence of a state that supposedly had no roots in the region's modern struggles. But as the iron doors of the world's most secretive archives begin to creak open, a different, far more disturbing picture emerges. Today, we look at the documents that history almost forgot. We examine the handshake between the swastika and the turban, the translation of hatred into the Arabic tongue as early as the 1930s, and the chilling blueprints for death camps that were intended to be built not in the forests of Poland, but in the hills of Judea and the valleys of the Galilee. We will follow the trail of Haj Amin al-Husseini, a man who saw in Adolf Hitler not an enemy, but a savior. This is a journey into the heart of a collaboration that sought to bring the final solution to the gates of Jerusalem. So, let us begin. The rain in Berlin on the 28th of November 1941 was a relentless, icy drizzle that seemed to soak into the very stones of the Wilhelmstrasse. The sky was the color of unpolished lead, a heavy ceiling over a city that was then the nerve center of a continent in flames. Inside the new Reich Chancellery, the atmosphere was one of sterile, clinical power. The halls, designed by Albert Speer to make any visitor feel like a speck of dust, echoed with the rhythmic click of jackboots on marble. In a private reception room, the air smelled of floor wax, expensive tobacco, and the faint metallic scent of the coal heaters. Standing by a window, looking out at the skeletal trees of the Tiergarten, was a man whose presence in this epicenter of Nordic ideology seemed almost surreal. He wore the immaculate white robes and the distinctive turban of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Haj Amin al-Husseini was not a prisoner, nor was he a desperate refugee. He was an honored guest of the Third Reich, a man whom the Nazi leadership viewed as the key to the entire Middle East. He stood there, waiting for his audience with the Führer, his face a mask of calm determination, while in his pocket he carried the hopes of a movement that had already begun to mirror the darkest impulses of his hosts. The documents preserved in the German Foreign Office, specifically the records found in the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts, under the classification of Akten zur deutschen Auswärtigen Politik, Series D, Volume 13, provide a verbatim account of what transpired when the doors finally opened. Hitler sat behind his massive desk, his eyes fixed on the man who claimed to represent the entire Arab world. The transcript of their conversation, recorded by the diplomat Fritz Grobe, reveals a terrifying synergy. The Mufti did not speak of borders or trade. He spoke of a shared struggle. He told Hitler that the Arabs were the natural friends of Germany because they shared the same three enemies: the British, the Communists, and the Jews. The Mufti's voice, described by those present as soft and melodious, carried a message of total destruction. He wasn't merely asking for German support for Arab independence. He was offering Arab complicity in the systematic elimination of the Jewish presence in the Middle East. He sought a formal declaration from the Reich that when German tanks eventually rolled through the Caucasus and into the Levant, the __quote there would be solved with the same ruthless efficiency being applied in Europe. To understand how a religious leader from Jerusalem ended up in a bunker in Berlin, one must look back to the year 1930. In the dusty libraries and coffee houses of Cairo and Damascus, a new kind of literature was beginning to circulate. It was a time when the world was reeling from the Great Depression, and radical ideologies were seen as the only cure for a broken system. In the archives of the British National Archives at Kew, colonial intelligence reports from this era describe a sudden influx of German-funded propaganda. The most significant of these was the first Arabic translations of Adolf Hitler's, quote, 3. It was not a clandestine, underground publication at first. Parts of it were serialized in the newspaper Al-Aram, and later published as a book in the mid-30s. The translation was not merely linguistic, it was cultural. The concepts of, quote, 4 and the, quote, 5 were adapted to fit a regional narrative. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, found in these pages a mirror for their own grievances. They saw the, quote, 6 of Germany as a blueprint for an Islamic awakening that would tolerate no internal, quote, 7. By the year 1936, the Mufti had already begun to put these ideologies into practice. The Arab Revolt of that year was not just a nationalist uprising against British colonial rule. It was a campaign of terror that targeted Jewish civilians with a new ideological fervor. In the archives of the Jerusalem police from that period, there are records of the Mufti's, quote, 8, which operated with a paramilitary discipline that many suspected was being funded by foreign hands. And indeed, the Italian and German archives now show that Mussolini and Hitler were funneling thousands of gold pounds to the Mufti's cause. The goal was simple: to destabilize the British and to ensure that the Jewish national home was strangled in its cradle. Husseini's followers began to wear uniforms, to march in formation, and to use the Nazi salute. In the markets of Jaffa and the alleyways of Nablus, the cry of underscore underscore, quote, underscore 9 underscore underscore was often heard as a challenge to the British patrols. It was a fusion of religious zeal and fascist methodology. A cocktail that would prove more explosive than anyone could have imagined. The Mufti's journey to Berlin was preceded by a trail of blood. In June 1941, while he was still navigating his way through the shifting alliances of the war, a horrific event occurred in Baghdad that served as a grim preview of his vision. This was the Farhud, a violent, Nazi-inspired pogrom against the Jewish population of Iraq. The documents in the Iraqi National Archives, later corroborated by the testimonies preserved at Yad Vashem, tell of a city that went mad for 2 days. Pro-Nazi officers, influenced by the Mufti's ideology and the broadcasts of Radio Berlin, turned on their neighbors. They marked Jewish homes with red paint, a chilling echo of the yellow stars being sewn onto coats in Europe. Men were dragged from buses and slaughtered. Women were raped in front of their families. Babies were murdered in their cradles. The Farhud was not a random riot. It was a calculated political act, a quote 10 that the Mufti had encouraged from his exile in the region. It proved that the quote 11 had successfully been exported. The hatred was no longer a foreign import. It had taken root in the soil of the Middle East, attended by leaders who saw the Holocaust as a necessary step for their own triumph. When the Mufti finally arrived in Berlin in the autumn of 1941, he was greeted with the protocol of a head of state. He was given a luxurious villa in the Klopstockstrasse, a monthly stipend of tens of thousands of marks, and a staff of German advisors. But his most important work was done in the shadows of the SS headquarters. He became a close associate of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the death camps. In the diaries of Himmler's staff, there are mentions of the Mufti's fascination with the technical aspects of the quote, 12, __. He was not a passive observer. He was a student. He visited the concentration camps at Sachsenhausen and Oranienburg, walking through the barracks and past the fences, observing the efficiency of the industrial killing machine. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a solution. He began to lobby the German High Command for the creation of a specialized SS unit composed of Muslims, the Handschar Division. In the German Federal Archives, Bundesarchiv, in Koblenz, there are photographs of the Mufti reviewing these troops, their fezzes adorned with the skull and crossbones of the SS. These were not just soldiers. They were the ideological vanguard of a new order that he intended to bring back to Palestine. One of the most chilling documents to surface in recent years is the blueprint for Einsatzgruppe Egypt. Historians like Klaus Michael Mahlmann and Martin Coopers, working with the military archives in Freiburg, have uncovered evidence that the SS had prepared a mobile killing unit specifically for the Middle East. This unit was led by Walter Rauff, the man who had helped design the gas vans used to murder thousands in Eastern Europe. The plan was precise. As soon as General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps broke through the British lines at El Alamein, Rauff's Einsatzgruppe would follow the tanks into Alexandria, Cairo, and then into the British Mandate for Palestine. Their mission was the systematic liquidation of the 500,000 Jews living there. The Mufti had already prepared the ground. He had provided lists of names, identified Jewish neighborhoods, and even suggested the location for the first death camp on Palestinian soil, in the valley of Dotan near Nablus. The machinery of death was ready. The gas was being prepared. The only thing standing between the Jewish population of the Middle East and a total Holocaust was a thin line of British and Commonwealth troops in the desert sands of Egypt. The Mufti's radio broadcasts from Berlin, transmitted via the Ziesen station, were a daily ritual for many in the Arab world. His voice would crackle across the airwaves, a mix of religious rhetoric and Nazi propaganda. He would tell his listeners that the Quran itself commanded the killing of Jews, twisting scripture to fit the racial theories of the Third Reich. He would urge them to kill the Jews wherever you find them, promising that this would please God, history, and the Führer. These broadcasts were not just words, they were instructions. They were designed to prepare the population for the arrival of the German liberators and the beginning of the cleansing. In the British intelligence reports of the time, there is a palpable sense of fear that these broadcasts were working, that the internal security of the Middle East was being eroded by the Mufti's toxic influence. The European problem was being broadcast into every home from Baghdad to Casablanca, creating a generation that would view the annihilation of their neighbors as a holy duty. As the tide of the war began to turn in 1943, following the German defeat at Stalingrad and the Allied victory at El Alamein, The Mufti did not waver. If anything, he became more desperate, more insistent. He lobbied the governments of Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania to stop the emigration of Jewish children to Palestine. In letters preserved in the archives of the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry, Husseini argued that these children should be sent to places where they would be under active supervision, a euphemism for the death camps of Poland. He was personally responsible for closing the escape routes of thousands of children who could have been saved, insisting that they be sent to the gas chambers rather than allowed to reach the shores of the land of Israel. This was not the act of a man fighting for national independence. It was the act of a committed genocidaire who had fully internalized the darkest core of Nazi ideology. He was more than a collaborator. He was an architect of the Holocaust in his own right, working within the German system to ensure that no Jew, no matter how small, would escape the net. The Mufti's influence also extended to the training of the next generation of leaders. In the specialized schools set up by the SS for Eastern volunteers, he oversaw the ideological indoctrination of young men who would later return to their home countries. They were taught that the modern world was a battle between the pure and the corrupt, and that the Jew was the source of all corruption. This poison was poured into the minds of future activists, officers, and clerics. The Muslim Brotherhood, which had expanded its reach during the war years, became the primary carrier of this ideological virus. In their internal documents from the late 1930s and early 40s, which were later seized by Egyptian authorities and are now partially accessible, the language of the Third Reich is unmistakable. They spoke of the Jewish danger in terms that were identical to those used by Joseph Goebbels. The alliance was not just a marriage of convenience. It was a merging of souls. The Brotherhood saw in the Nazi state a model for the future Islamic state, a monolithic, expansionist, and Jew-free society. One afternoon in 1944, as the Allied bombing of Berlin grew more frequent, the Mufti reportedly held a meeting with several high-ranking SS officers in a bunker beneath the city. According to a witness who later gave testimony to the French intelligence services, the Mufti was shown a series of photographs from the Majdanek extermination camp, which had recently been liberated by the Red Army. The photographs showed the piles of shoes, the canisters of Zyklon B, and the charred remains in the crematoria. The witness expected the Mufti to be shocked, perhaps even to distance himself from the Reich as the end drew near. Instead, the Mufti looked at the images with a cold, analytical gaze. He turned to the officer next to him and asked, in his soft, measured voice, if the same technology could be transported to a warmer climate. He was not worried about the morality of the act. He was worried about the logistics. He was already thinking about the next war, the one he would lead once the Germans were gone. He knew that the Reich might fall, but he believed that the final solution was a torch that he could carry back to the Middle East. The archives also reveal the Mufti's role in the formation of the SS Osttürkischer Waffenverband, a unit composed of Muslims from the Soviet Union and the Balkans. He spent much of 1944 traveling to the front lines, encouraging these men to fight to the death for the Führer. In his speeches, he framed the war as a cosmic battle between the forces of believing humanity and the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. He was the bridge between the racial pseudoscience of the SS and the religious fervor of his followers. The records of the German High Command show that they valued the Mufti precisely because he could translate Nazi goals into a language that resonated with the masses of the East. He was the Reich's most effective psychological weapon. But as the Soviet ring tightened around Berlin in early 1945, the Mufti's luxurious life began to crumble. The villas were bombed, the stipends stopped, and the Handschar division began to desert. Yet, even in the chaos of the Götterdämmerung, the Mufti remained focused on his singular goal. In the final weeks of the war, the Mufti managed to escape from the crumbling capital of the Third Reich. He fled south towards the Swiss border, carrying with him a suitcase full of gold and a mind full of secrets. He was eventually captured by French forces, but his status was ambiguous. Was he a war criminal? A political leader? A religious figure? The British wanted him. The Jews wanted him tried like the men at Nuremberg, but the French saw him as a potential pawn in their own colonial games in North Africa. While he was held in a villa outside Paris, the Mufti continued to hold court, receiving visitors and planning his return to the Middle East. He knew that the documents he had signed in Berlin were a death warrant if they ever saw the light of day. But he also knew that in the emerging Cold War, many would be willing to overlook his past in exchange for his influence. He sat in the French garden, sipping tea, while the world counted the dead in the camps he had so admired, already plotting how to finish the work that Hitler had started. The escape of Haj Amin al-Husseini from French custody in 1946 remains one of the great mysteries of the post-war era. Some say he donned a disguise. Others say high-level officials in the French government looked the other way. He surfaced in Cairo to a hero's welcome, greeted by the very same Muslim Brotherhood that had helped distribute Mein Kampf a decade earlier. He was the link between the defeated Axis and the rising tide of Arab nationalism. He brought with him not just the memory of his alliance with Hitler, but a cadre of former Nazi officers and propaganda experts who would help shape the military and intelligence services of the new Arab states. The European problem had not died in the bunker in Berlin. It had been transplanted. The ideology of the Holocaust had found a new home, a new language, and a new set of executioners. The Mufti's arrival in Egypt marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle for Palestine, one that would be fought with the same all-or-nothing exterminationist rhetoric he had learned from the SS. As he settled into his new headquarters in Cairo, the Mufti began to reconstruct his network. He reached out to his old contacts in the Levant, the men who had led the 1936 revolt and the Baghdad Farhud. He told them that the war was not over. It had merely moved. He began to organize the Holy War Army, a paramilitary force that would be the primary Arab combatant in the 1948 war. The officers of this army were often men who had been trained in German schools or had served in the Mufti's SS units. They brought with them the tactics of the Wehrmacht and the worldview of the Gestapo. The archives of the Arab League from this period, though still largely closed to the public, contain traces of this influence. Memos that speak of the Jewish threat in terms that would have been familiar to any reader of Der Stürmer. The Mufti was ensuring that the transition from the Holocaust to the war against the emerging state of Israel was seamless. A continuous line of conflict fueled by the same genocidal intent. The most haunting evidence of this continuity lies in the interrogation records of captured Arab fighters in 1948. Israeli intelligence officers, many of them survivors of the European Holocaust themselves, were shocked to find that their prisoners were carrying copies of Arabic Nazi pamphlets and wearing equipment that had been manufactured in the factories of the Third Reich. In the pockets of dead soldiers in the hills of Galilee, they found photos of the Mufti with Hitler, kept as talismans. It was a moment of profound, terrifying realization. The enemy they had fled in Europe had followed them to their ancestral home. The shadows of Auschwitz were stretching across the Mediterranean, cast by a man who had sat in the halls of the Reich Chancellery and planned for this very moment. The Mufti had successfully convinced the generation that the European problem was their problem, and that the only solution was the one he had discussed with the Führer in 1941. Yet for decades, this connection was downplayed or outright ignored by many historians. It was more convenient to view the Arab-Israeli conflict as a simple land dispute, a clash of two nationalisms, rather than a continuation of the 20th century's most toxic ideology. But the documents do not lie. They are there in the archives of Berlin, London, Cairo, and Jerusalem. The letters, the transcripts, the bank transfers, and the blueprints. They show a man who was not a victim of history, but an active, enthusiastic participant in its most horrific chapter. They show a movement that was not seeking justice, but annihilation. As we peel back the layers of this investigation, we find that the Mufti's legacy did not end with his death in 1974. It lived on in the organizations he helped build, the ideologies he helped translate, and the myths he helped create. The safe narrative that the Holocaust had nothing to do with the Palestinian struggle was his final, most successful piece of propaganda. The Mufti's influence was particularly strong on a young relative of his who would go on to lead the Palestinian movement for decades, Yasser Arafat. While the direct biological link is sometimes debated, the ideological and political succession is undeniable. Arafat himself often spoke of the Mufti as a mentor and a hero, a man who sacrificed everything for the cause. In the early training camps of the PLO, the Mufti's old associates were often the ones providing the instruction. The rhetoric of total liberation and the refusal to recognize the Jewish state's right to exist were direct descendants of the Mufti's final solution platform. The documents from the PLO's early years, many of which were seized during the 1982 Lebanon War and are now held in Israeli archives, show a clear ideological lineage. They reveal a movement that was steeped in the Mufti's worldview, a worldview that had been forged in the fires of Nazi Germany and tempered in the bitterness of the post-war Middle East. As the evening light fades over the archives today, researchers still find forgotten folders that add new details to this dark tapestry. In a recently declassified file from the French Internal Security Service, there is a report from a spy who lived in the Mufti's inner circle in the late 1940s. The report describes a man who was obsessed with the idea that the work in Europe had been left unfinished. The Mufti would sit late into the night, looking at maps of the new state of Israel, marking the locations of kibbutzim and towns with the same clinical detachment he had used when looking at the photos of Majdanek. He told his followers that the mistake the Germans made was not in their goal, but in their timing. He believed that the spirit of the Third Reich could be resurrected in the dunes of the Sinai and the mountains of Samaria. He was convinced that the world would eventually look away, just as it had in the 1930s, and allow him to complete the vision he had shared with the Führer in that cold, rain-swept office in Berlin. The Mufti's presence in the Middle East was a bridge between two worlds, a conduit for an ideology that should have died in 1945, but instead found a second life. He transformed a regional conflict into a global ideological crusade. He ensured that the hatred of the Jew was not just a political stance, but a foundational pillar of a new identity. This was his true achievement, the successful grafting of the Holocaust's logic onto the heart of the Middle East. And yet, even as he planned for the future, the ghosts of his past were never far behind. In his final years in Beirut, he was a man surrounded by shadows, a relic of a defeated empire, who nonetheless saw his ideas flourishing in the minds of a new generation. He had outlived Hitler, he had outlived Himmler, and he had seen his European problem become the defining struggle of the Middle East. The documents are silent now, tucked away in their acid-free folders, but their contents remain explosive. They challenge us to look beyond the surface of the conflict and see the deeper, darker currents that continue to pull at the region. They remind us that the past is never truly dead, and that the truth, we are told, is often just a shield for a reality that is too dangerous to confront. The Mufti's handshake with Hitler was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was the birth of a strategy that continues to shape our world today. And as we look at the maps he drew and the letters he wrote, we realize that the smoke from the chimneys of Europe might have long since cleared, but the fire that lit them was carried across the sea in a white turban, waiting for the wind to rise again. The trail of evidence leads from the opulent halls of Berlin to the secret training camps of the 1950s, revealing a network that refused to accept defeat. The Mufti's gold, his connections, and his unwavering commitment to a Jew-free Middle East created a foundation for a radicalism that would eventually give birth to organizations whose names are all too familiar to us today. As the sun set on the first generation of Arab nationalists, the seeds the Mufti had sown were already beginning to sprout into something even more radical, something that would replace his political fascism with a theological one, ensuring that the war he started in 1921 would never truly find a peaceful end. The smoke of the Second World War had barely dissipated when the Mufti's vision began to rematerialize in the sun-drenched streets of Cairo, proving that the defeat of the Third Reich was merely a geographical setback for a movement that had already transcended its European borders. As the world turned its eyes to the reconstruction of Europe, a more silent, more insidious reconstruction was taking place in the heart of the Middle East, where the infrastructure of hatred was being rebuilt using the very same blueprints that had been drawn in Berlin. The Mufti, now a guest of King Farouk and a patron of the Muslim Brotherhood, did not spend his days in quiet retirement. Instead, he transformed his villa in the suburbs of Heliopolis into a shadow chancellery, a place where the remnants of the defeated Axis could find a new purpose. The air in those rooms was thick with the scent of jasmine and the stale smoke of Turkish cigarettes, but the conversations were conducted with a cold, Germanic precision that would have been familiar to any officer of the Wilhelmstrasse. The archives of the British Foreign Office, specifically the FO 370 series, contain frantic reports from intelligence officers stationed in Egypt during the late 1940s. They watched with growing alarm as a stream of technical advisors began to arrive in the region, men with false names but unmistakably Prussian bearings. These were the experts of the Reich's propaganda machine, the engineers of the SS, and the strategists of the Abwehr who had escaped the dragnet of Nuremberg. They were not seeking refuge, they were seeking employment. The Mufti served as their primary broker, connecting these veterans of the Holocaust with the emerging military regimes of the Arab world. He knew that while the German tanks had been crushed, the methodology of the final solution remained a potent weapon for those who shared his obsession with the Jewish question. In the quiet courtyards of Cairo, the Mufti was building a bridge between the industrial genocide of the past and the ideological warfare of the future. One of the most significant figures in this secret history was Johann von Leers, a man who had once been a close collaborator of Joseph Goebbels and a primary architect of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. By the mid-1950s, von Leers had surfaced in Cairo under the name Omar Amin, working directly for the Egyptian Ministry of Information. The documents in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz show that von Leers was not acting alone. He was the center of a vast network of former Nazis who were helping to shape the narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Under the Mufti's guidance, von Leers translated the classic tropes of European anti-Semitism into a language that resonated with the religious and political sensibilities of the region. The protocols of the Elders of Zion were reprinted in massive quantities, and the radio broadcasts that had once originated in Zissen were replaced by the Voice of the Arabs, which utilized the same techniques of dehumanization and psychological terror that had been perfected in Berlin. The physical evidence of this continuity was most visible during the 1948 war, a conflict that the Mufti saw as the direct continuation of the struggle he had discussed with Hitler. In the vaults of the Israeli State Archives, there are reports from the newly formed intelligence services that describe the capture of Arab paramilitary units led by former German officers. In the battle for Jerusalem, the Mufti's Holy War Army employed tactics that were carbon copies of the partisan cleansing operations the SS had conducted in the forests of Belarus. The snipers who targeted Jewish civilians from the walls of the Old City were often guided by men who had learned their trade on the Eastern Front. This was the moment when the European problem became a permanent feature of the Middle Eastern landscape, a legacy of blood that was passed from the hands of the dying Reich to the hands of a new generation of radicalized fighters. Inside the villa in Heliopolis, a young Egyptian army officer often visited the Mufti, listening with rapt attention to the older man's stories of the great struggle in Europe. This officer, who would later be known to the world as Gamal Abdel Nasser, saw the Mufti not just as a religious leader, but as a link to a world of disciplined, total power. The influence of the Mufti on the free officers movement was profound, providing them with an ideological framework that combined nationalism with a virulent, conspiratorial anti-Zionism. In the memoirs of those who were present, the Mufti is described as a man who always kept a copy of a particular document on his desk, a map of the Middle East, with certain areas circled in red. These were the locations of the planned camps, the sites where the solution would have been implemented if Rommel had reached the Nile. The Mufti never forgot those red circles. He simply waited for a new army to fill them. The connection between the Mufti's Nazi-aligned past and the modern structures of radicalism is most clearly seen in the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood. The organization's paramilitary wing, the Special Apparatus, was designed with a cell structure and a secret hierarchy that mirrored the Gestapo. In the 1930s, the Brotherhood had received funding from German agents, and this relationship matured during the war into a full ideological partnership. When the Mufti returned to Egypt, he worked to ensure that the Brotherhood would become the primary carrier of his legacy. The documents seized by the Egyptian government during the various crackdowns on the Brotherhood in the 1950s and 60s, which are now partially housed in the archives of the Ministry of the Interior, reveal a staggering depth of Nazi-inspired thought. The group's leaders spoke of the cleansing of the soul through the elimination of the corrupter, a phrase that was a direct Arabic translation of the SS's own internal justifications for the Holocaust. As the years passed, the Mufti's role as the father of Palestinian nationalism, became a carefully curated myth designed to hide the darker reality of his collaboration. But the shadows were hard to erase. In the 1960s, the Israeli Mossad launched Operation Damocles, a campaign targeted at the German scientists who were helping Egypt develop long-range rockets. These scientists, many of whom had worked at Peenemünde on the V-2 rockets that struck London, were brought to Egypt through the Mufti's old networks. One such scientist, Wolfgang Pilz, lived in a villa that was guarded by the same men who had once protected the Mufti. When Israeli agents began to intercept the scientist's mail, they found letters that expressed a chilling nostalgia for the, quote, 58 in Germany, and a shared commitment to finishing the quote, 59 in the Middle East. The Holocaust was not a memory for these men. It was a mission that had simply moved to a different theater of operations. The Mufti's shadow also loomed over the trials at Nuremberg, and later, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. While he was never brought to justice himself, his name appears repeatedly in the testimony of those who were. Dieter Wisliceny, a close aide to Adolf Eichmann, testified that the Mufti had been a constant presence at the RSHA, the Reich Security Main Office, and had personally encouraged the acceleration of the gas chambers. In the records of the Nuremberg trials, specifically in the documents of the quote 60, there are memos from the German Foreign Office that complain about the Mufti's quote 61 because he was constantly demanding that more Jews be killed and fewer be allowed to immigrate. These documents, which are preserved in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, provide an irrefutable link between the Mufti and the highest levels of the Holocaust's administration. He was not a bystander. He was an accelerator. By the time of his death in 1974, the Mufti had lived to see the transformation of his movement from a local nationalist struggle into a global ideological front. He had passed the torch to men who would form the PLO and eventually to the founders of Hamas, which emerged as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Hamas Covenant, published in 1988, is perhaps the most enduring monument to the Mufti's work. Its language is a seamless blend of radical theology and the very same European anti-Semitic tropes that the Mufti had brought back from Berlin. It speaks of a global Jewish conspiracy that controls the world's media and wealth, using the exact same phrasing found in the Arabic translations of quote, 62 from the 1930s. The quote, 63 had not been solved. It had been institutionalized in the charter of a movement that would dominate the 21st century's headlines. In the dusty archives of the French intelligence services at the Château de Vincennes, there is a file that was only recently made available to researchers. It contains the surveillance reports on the Mufti during his final years in Beirut. The agents describe a man who was obsessed with his own place in history, a man who spent his afternoons writing his memoirs and receiving young militants from all over the world. These young men would sit at his feet, listening to the same stories he had once told Nasser and Arafat. The reports note that the Mufti often spoke of the, quote, 64 of the Nazis, by which he meant their failure to win the war. But he never spoke of their quote, 65 . To him, the genocide was a logical necessity, a strategic requirement that he hoped his successors would one day have the power to complete. He died in a luxury apartment, surrounded by the tokens of a life spent in the service of a darkness that the world thought it had extinguished in 1945. The legacy of the Mufti is a challenge to the modern world's understanding of the Holocaust. It forces us to confront the fact that the, quote, 66 was not a closed chapter of European history, but a virus that was deliberately released into the Middle East. The claims that the Palestinian movement has no connection to the Holocaust are systematically dismantled by the records of the very men who led that movement. When we look at the documents, the SS pay stubs for the Mufti's guards, the transcripts of his meetings with Himmler, the reports of Nazi scientists in Cairo, we see a continuous line of intent. We see that the State of Israel was not a, quote, 67 of the Holocaust, as many claim, but a target of the same forces that carried out the Holocaust, forces that were active in the region long before the first survivors stepped off a boat in Haifa. This is the truth that the archives tell, a truth that is often buried beneath layers of political convenience. As a researcher sat in the quiet reading room of the Yad Vashem archives recently, they came across a small, unassuming photograph that had been misfiled for years. It showed a group of men in civilian clothes standing in front of a half-finished stone building in the hills near Nablus in 1942. On the back of the photo, in the neat, sloping handwriting of a German officer, were the words, quote, 68, quote. The architecture of the building was unmistakably industrial, with narrow windows and a reinforced basement. It was a fragment of a world that almost was, a physical manifestation of the Mufti's dream. The photo is a reminder that the, quote, 69 was only inches away from becoming a permanent Middle Eastern reality. It serves as a silent witness to the proximity of the abyss, a chilling proof that the plans were not just words spoken in a Berlin office, but stone and mortar being prepared in the Judean soil. The story of the Mufti and his alliance with the Third Reich is not just a historical curiosity. It is the key to understanding the present. It explains why the rhetoric of certain movements today sounds so hauntingly familiar, and why the hatred of the Jewish state is often expressed in terms that have nothing to do with borders and everything to do with the underscore underscore quote underscore 70 underscore underscore. It is a narrative of survival, not just the survival of the Jewish people, but the survival of an ideology that was supposed to have been buried in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. The Mufti ensured that the fire was kept alive, shielded from the wind of history, until it could be fanned into a new conflagration. The documents provide the proof, but the world often chooses to look away, preferring the simpler, safer lie that the Holocaust was someone else's problem. In the end, the Mufti's greatest success was not the quote 71 or the quote 72 division, but the successful erasure of his own history from the global consciousness. He transformed himself from a Nazi collaborator into a national hero, and in doing so, he allowed his ideology to pass through the gates of the modern world undetected. But for those who know where to look, the signs are everywhere. They are in the textbooks that recycle his propaganda, in the speeches of leaders who echo his themes, and in the archives that continue to yield their secrets to those who have the courage to read them. The truth is not hidden, it is simply ignored. And as the researchers close their folders and the lights in the archives are dimmed, one cannot help but feel that the most dangerous documents are the ones that are still missing, the ones that were whispered in the Mufti's ear in the dead of night. One such document is said to exist in a private collection in South America. A series of letters between the Mufti and a former SS officer who fled to Argentina. The letters, which have never been seen by the public, allegedly detail a plan for a, quote, 73 that would span decades, a strategy of, quote, 74 that would eventually lead to the achievement of their shared goals. If these letters are real, they would prove that the Mufti's work did not end with the creation of the State of Israel, but merely entered a new, more covert phase. The thought of what those letters might contain is enough to make any historian tremble. It suggests that the war we see today is only the visible part of a much older, much deeper conflict, a conflict that began in the 1930s and has never truly seen a ceasefire. The driver who had once taken the Mufti to his meetings in Cairo lived to a very old age, and in his final years, he told a story to a local journalist that was never published. He spoke of a night in 1947 when he drove the Mufti to a secret meeting on the banks of the Nile. The Mufti was joined by a group of men who spoke a language the driver did not understand, but their voices were harsh and commanding. They spent the entire night looking at a large silver chest that had been brought from Europe. When the meeting was over, the chest was buried in the desert sands, and the Mufti told the driver that the contents of that chest would one day quote, 75 __. To this day, no one knows what was in that chest or where exactly it was buried. But the driver's eyes would always fill with a strange, lingering terror whenever he spoke of that night. The secrets of the Mufti's alliance with the Reich are not just in the archives. They are buried in the very earth of the region, waiting for a truth that perhaps the world is not yet ready to hear. The investigation into the Mufti's legacy leaves us not with a sense of closure, but with a sense of profound unease. It reveals a world where the boundaries between past and present, between Europe and the Middle East, are far more porous than we would like to believe. It shows that the, quote, 76 was always intended to be a global one, and that the shadows of the Holocaust are still being cast by the same men who helped light the fires. The documents are there, the names are known, and the dates are fixed in history. But the most chilling realization of all is that the Mufti's vision did not die with him. It was merely translated into a new tongue, waiting for a future that he had already begun to build in the rain-swept streets of Berlin. The files remain open. But the most important pages are often the ones that have been torn out by hands that are still active in the shadows. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows over the ancient stones of Jerusalem, one can almost hear the echoes of the voices from 1941. They speak of a future that was never meant to be, yet a future that haunts every corner of the present. The Mufti's handshake with Hitler remains the most significant, yet least understood event of the 20th century's Middle Eastern history. It is the missing link that explains the ferocity of the conflict and the endurance of an ideology that should have been extinguished long ago. The truth is there, etched into the records and buried in the stories of those who were there, but it remains a truth that is too dangerous for many to acknowledge. The archive of shadows is never truly closed, and the name of Haj Amin al-Husseini continues to be whispered in the corridors where the next war is being planned. There is a rumor among the staff of the National Library that a specific box of the Mufti's personal papers, marked for destruction in the late 1970s, was instead spirited away by an unknown party. This box allegedly contained the Mufti's personal correspondence with the founders of the modern radical movements, detailing how the tactics of the Third Reich were to be adapted for the 21st century. Some say the box is in a vault in Switzerland. Others say it is hidden in a basement in Gaza. Wherever it is, its existence suggests that the blueprint for the current chaos was written long ago by a man who saw the Holocaust not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a masterpiece to be refined and repeated in the land of his ancestors. The final chapter of this investigation has yet to be written, as the evidence continues to surface in the most unexpected places. In a small, dusty shop in the old city of Jerusalem, an elderly man still keeps a tattered first edition Arabic translation of __quote _77 _ hidden behind a stack of old newspapers. He doesn't sell it, but sometimes he shows it to a select few, pointing to the margin notes written in a familiar, elegant hand. The notes are in Arabic, but the ideas they express are pure, undiluted 19th century German racial theory, adapted for a new crusade. The book is a physical link to a world that most believe is gone, a silent proof that the European problem found a home in the heart of the Middle East and never truly left. The man in the shop never says who gave him the book, but he always smiles when he mentions the year 1941, as if he is guarding a secret that the rest of the world has forgotten. The trail of the Mufti leads back to that shop, to those notes, and to a past that refuses to stay buried, reminding us that some shadows are long enough to reach across generations. The most haunting detail of all was found in a footnote of a declassified intelligence report from the 1950s, which mentioned a particular phrase the Mufti used in his final letters. He spoke of the light that would come from the north to finish the work in the south. For years, analysts thought he was referring to a Soviet alliance, but as the links between the Mufti and the remnants of the Nazi underground became clearer, a more terrifying possibility emerged. He wasn't talking about a country. He was talking about an ideology, a northern light of pure, cold destruction that he had brought back from Berlin and planted like a time bomb in the soul of his movement. The bomb is still ticking, its mechanism hidden deep within the rhetoric of the modern struggle, a gift from the Führer to the Mufti that the world is only now beginning to understand. The archives are silent on the final location of that bomb, but its presence is felt in every echo of the hatred that refuses to die. The research continues, but the questions only multiply as the files are opened. The story of the Mufti and the Holocaust is not a footnote to history. It is the headline that has been suppressed for 80 years. It is the narrative of a collaboration that shaped the modern world, a bridge built of blood and ideology that spans the Mediterranean. As the last witnesses fade away and the documents become the only voice left, the truth remains a dangerous, elusive thing, hidden in plain sight for those who have the eyes to see it. The Mufti's villa in Cairo is gone, replaced by modern buildings and busy streets. But the ideas that were born there continue to haunt the world, a legacy of a handshake that changed the course of history. The investigation ends here, not because the truth has been fully revealed, but because the truth is still unfolding in the headlines of today. A story that began in a rainy office in Berlin and has no end in sight. The last record of the Mufti's public life is a photograph taken at a funeral in Beirut, where he stands amongst a new generation of leaders, his face old and wrinkled, but his eyes as sharp as they were in 1941. He is leaning in to whisper something to a young man who would later become a high-ranking commander in a movement that still exists today. No one knows what he said, but the young man's expression was one of intense, reverent focus. It was the final handoff, the last instruction from the man who had brought the European problem to the Middle East and made it his own. The photograph was found in a discarded file in a Lebanese government office, a silent witness to the continuity of a mission that the world has tried and failed to forget. The Mufti's secret remains safe with those who followed him, a hidden fire that continues to burn in the heart of a conflict that knows no peace.